Back about 4,000 years to a land called Nubia, in what's now northern Sudan. The ancient Egyptians called this region Taseti, which means land of the bow, because the Nubians were famous for being incredible archers. And when I say incredible, I mean these guys could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback while moving at full speed. The Kingdom of Kush emerged around 1070 BCE, but the people living there had been developing their civilization for centuries before that. They had something that made them incredibly wealthy: gold. Lots and lots of gold. The gold mines of Nubia were so productive that they basically funded the Egyptian empire for generations. But here's the kicker. Eventually, the people who controlled those gold mines decided they didn't want to be junior partners anymore. Can you imagine being that wealthy, but having to constantly pay tribute to your northern neighbors? It's like being a millionaire who has to give half their money to someone else every year. Eventually, you'd probably get tired of that arrangement too, right? The Kushites were also master ironworkers at a time when iron was the cutting-edge technology of the day. While many civilizations were still using bronze weapons and tools, the Kushites had figured out how to smelt iron on an industrial scale. Their capital city of Meroë became such a major iron production center that archaeologists today call it the Birmingham of ancient Africa because of all the iron slag they found there. But it wasn't just their military technology that made them special. The Kushites developed their own writing system, built incredible temples, and created a unique blend of African and Egyptian culture that was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Now, to understand why the Kushites were able to conquer Egypt, we need to talk about what was happening in Egypt during the 8th century BCE. And honestly, it wasn't pretty. Egypt was basically falling apart from the inside out. The once mighty Egyptian empire was divided into competing kingdoms. In the north, you had pharaohs who could barely control the Nile. life. Taharqa chose to fight, and the result was one of the most epic military conflicts of the ancient world. The war between the Kushite Pharaohs and the Assyrians lasted for decades and involved massive armies clashing across the deserts and river valleys of Egypt and Sudan. The first major Assyrian invasion came in 674 BCE, and surprisingly, Taharqa managed to defeat them. Think about that. An African pharaoh successfully repelled the most powerful military force of his time. The Assyrians were so shocked by their like a hurricane. They captured Memphis, advanced on Thebes, and for the first time in nearly a century, the Kushite pharaohs were forced to abandon Egypt permanently. But here's what's incredible about how this story ends. Even though the Kushites lost political control of Egypt, they didn't disappear. They retreated south to their homeland in Sudan and continued ruling the Kingdom of Kush for another 1,000 years. Let me repeat that, another 1,000 years. Think about what that means. The Roman Empire